ਦੇਖ ਲਓ ਜੇ 1-2 ਮਿੰਟ ਅਜੇ ਵੇਟ ਕਰਨੀ ਆ। 10 ਵੱਜ ਕੇ 1 ਮਿੰਟ ਹੀ ਹੋਇਆ, ਹਜੇ 2 ਮਿੰਟ ਹੋਏ ਆ। ਸੋ
ਹੂੰ
10 ਵੱਜ ਕੇ ਆਪਾਂ 5 ਮਿੰਟ ਤੇ ਵੀ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ।
5 ਤੇ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਹਾਂ।
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਹਾਂਜੀ।
ਹਾਂਜੀ, ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਹੈ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਫੋਨ ਦੇ ਨਾਂ ਤੇ ਸਾਈਨ ਆਨ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ ਨਾ, ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਨਾਂ ਤੇ ਸਾਈਨ ਆਨ ਕਰ ਲਓ ਤਾਂ ਵਧੀਆ ਹੈ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ੍ਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਆਨਲਾਈਨ ਸੈਸ਼ਨਸ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ 'ਚ ਹੈਕਿੰਗ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਦੇ ਇਸ਼ੂ ਕਾਫੀ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਆ। ਸੋ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਸੈਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਸਿਕਿਉਰਿਟੀ ਦਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਰੱਖਣ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਆ। ਸੋ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਫੋਨ ਦੇ ਨਾਂ ਤੋਂ, ਆਈਫੋਨ ਜਾਂ ਕੁਝ ਹੋਰ ਨਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਸਾਈਨ ਆਨ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ, ਫਿਰ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਮਝ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮੈਂਬਰ ਜੁਆਇਨ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਸਾਨੂੰ, ਉਹ ਕੋਈ ਜੈਨੂਅਨਲੀ ਸੈਸ਼ਨ ਅਟੈਂਡ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਜਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਹੈਕ ਕਰਕੇ ਸੈਸ਼ਨ ਖਰਾਬ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ। ਸੋ ਇਹ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪੋ ਆਪਣੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨਾਂ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਜੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਡਿਸਪਲੇ ਹੋਣ ਤਾਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਹੈਲਪਫੁਲ ਆ। ਮਨੋਹਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ, ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਨੂੰ।
ਆਲਸੋ ਭਾਜੀ ਵੀਡੀਓ ਦੀ ਰਿਕੁਐਸਟ ਪਾ ਦਿਓ ਜੇ ਵੀਡੀਓ ਟਰਨ ਔਨ ਕਰ ਲੈਣ ਸਾਰੇ।
ਵੀਡੀਓ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਵੀ ਵੀਡੀਓ ਜੇ ਟਰਨ ਔਨ ਕਰ ਲਓ ਤੇ ਵਧੀਆ।
It makes the interaction process much better if you guys
ਹਾਂਜੀ,
turn on videos.
ਕਨੈਕਟ ਕਰਨਾ ਸੌਖਾ। The session is going to be in English.
Yeah. So primarily,
ਰੱਖਾਂਗੇ
yeah.
ਨਾ, ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਹਾਈਬ੍ਰਿਡ ਰੱਖਾਂਗੇ।
Uh,
But Professor Mandair is going to give his talk in English, and questions, if you want to ask in Punjabi, that's fine. But mostly the session will be in English. ਬਸ 1 ਮਿੰਟ ਆਪਾਂ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਕਰੀਏ ਜੀ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ।
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਹਾਂਜੀ।
Okay, so format A, basically Professor Mandair would give a presentation, and then after the presentation, we'll have a question answer session, and write down your questions if you have any, and we'll have like more than an hour for the discussion. ਮੈਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਇੰਟਰੋਡਕਸ਼ਨ ਤੋਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਟਾਕ ਦੇਣਗੇ, ਫਿਰ ਆਪਾਂ ਅੱਗੇ ਵਧਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਜੂਨ 84 ਦੇ ਘੱਲੂਘਾਰੇ ਨੇ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੂੰ, ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦੇ ਹਰ ਹਿੱਸੇ 'ਚ ਵਸਦੇ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਝੰਜੋੜਿਆ, ਪੰਜਾਬ 'ਚ ਵੀ, ਬਾਹਰ ਵੀ। ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਾਰੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਤੋਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਡੂੰਘੇ ਪੱਧਰ ਤੇ ਕਿਸੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਰੂਪ 'ਚ ਪ੍ਰਭਾਵਿਤ ਹੋਏ ਆ। ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਪੰਜਾਬ 'ਚ ਮੂਵਮੈਂਟ ਚੱਲੀ। ਮੂਵਮੈਂਟ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਸਵਾਲ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋਏ ਵੀ ਹੁਣ ਕਿੱਧਰ ਨੂੰ, ਹੁਣ ਕੀ ਕਰੀਏ। ਕਈ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਦਿਮਾਗ 'ਚ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਜਿੱਥੋਂ ਖਤਮ ਹੋਈ ਆ ਗੱਲ, ਉੱਥੋਂ ਦੁਬਾਰਾ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋਵੇ। ਪਰ ਕਈ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਸੋਚ ਰਹੇ ਸੀ। ਮੈਂ ਪੰਜਾਬ 'ਚ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਗੁਰਭਗਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਦਾ ਸੀ ਅਕਸਰ। ਡਾਕਟਰ ਗੁਰਭਗਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਕਮਾਲ ਦੇ ਦਾਨਸ਼ਵਰ ਸੀ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਚੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਸੀ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ UC ਅਰਵਾਈਨ ਤੋਂ MA, UC ਸੈਂਟਾ ਕਰੂਜ਼ ਤੋਂ PhD ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀ, ਵਿਲੀਅਮ ਬਲੇਕ ਤੇ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ 'ਚ। ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਹਰ ਵੇਲੇ ਸਵਾਲ ਇੱਕੋ ਹੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਹੁਣ ਕੀ ਕਰੀਏ। ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਦਿਨ ਉਹ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਵੀ ਮੈਂ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਆਇਆ ਤੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸ ਹੋਈ ਸੀ, ਤੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਦੋ ਮੁੰਡਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਪੇਪਰ ਪੜ੍ਹੇ, ਤੇ ਉਹ ਇੰਨੇ ਕਮਾਲ ਦੇ ਪੇਪਰ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਮੈਂ ਹੈਰਾਨ ਰਹਿ ਗਿਆ ਵੀ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਅੰਦਰੋਂ ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਨਵਾਂ ਰੁਝਾਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਉੱਠ ਰਿਹਾ। ਮੈਂ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਨਾਂ ਦੱਸੇ। ਇੱਕ ਨਾਂ ਸੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਅਰਵਿੰਦ-ਪਾਲ ਸਿੰਘ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਦਾ, ਦੂਜਾ ਨਵਦੀਪ ਸਿੰਘ ਮੰਡੇਰ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਛੋਟੇ ਭਰਾ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕਮਾਲ ਦੇ ਸਕਾਲਰ ਹੈ। ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਨੇ ਕੈਮਿਸਟਰੀ 'ਚ PhD ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਕੈਮੀਕਲ ਇੰਡਸਟਰੀ 'ਚ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਸੀ। ਜਿਵੇਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ, ਦੁਨੀਆ ਭਰ ਦੇ ਸਿੱਖ 84 ਦੇ ਘੱਲੂਘਾਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਝੰਜੋੜੇ ਗਏ। ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ 'ਚੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਸੀ। ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਵੈਂਟਰੀ 'ਚ ਲੋਕਲ ਪੱਧਰ ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਯੂਥ ਦੇ ਗਰੁੱਪ ਦੇ ਰੂਪ 'ਚ ਐਕਟੀਵਿਟੀ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤੀ। ਐਕਟੀਵਿਟੀ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਈ ਇੱਕ ਮੈਗਜ਼ੀਨ ਸਿੱਖ ਰਿਫਾਰਮਰ ਦੇ ਰੂਪ 'ਚ। ਜਿਵੇਂ ਦਰੀਦਾ ਵਰਗੇ ਫਿਲਾਸਫਰ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਵੀ ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਦਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਸੈਸ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਸਪੌਂਟੇਨੀਅਸ ਆ, ਉਹਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਹੋਰ ਓਰੀਜਨ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਐਬਸਟਰੈਕਟ। ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਕਿਸੇ ਚੀਜ਼ ਦੀ ਇੰਪਰਫੈਕਟ ਰਿਪਰੈਜ਼ੈਂਟੇਸ਼ਨ ਨਹੀਂ। ਰਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਉਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਸੈਸ ਨੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਮਸਲੇ ਸੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਵੱਡੇ ਪੱਧਰ ਤੇ ਇੰਗੇਜ ਕਰਾਇਆ ਕਿ ਅੰਦਰ ਕੀ ਚੱਲ ਰਿਹਾ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਇੱਕ ਕਲੋਨੀਅਲ ਇਵੈਂਟ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈ, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਐਡਵੈਂਟ ਆਫ ਕਲੋਨੀਅਲ ਮੋਡਰਨਿਟੀ ਇਨ ਪੰਜਾਬ, ਹਾਊ ਡਿਡ that transform the Sikhs in general? How did that transform the language that the Sikhs speak? How has it transformed the projects the Sikhs have been working on worldwide, everywhere? So ਉਹ ਟਰਾਂਸਫੋਰਮੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਸੋਚਣਾ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤਾ ਐਂਡ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਫਿਲੋਸੋਫੀਕਲ ਇੰਟਰੋਸਪੈਕਸ਼ਨ ਕੀਤੀ। ਜਿਹੜੇ ਫਿਲੋਸੋਫੀਕਲ ਓਰੀਜਨ ਸੀ ਹੈਗੇਲੀਅਨ ਫਿਲਾਸਫੀ, ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਇੰਪੀਰੀਅਲਿਜ਼ਮ ਦੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਸਪੈਕਟਰਲ ਪ੍ਰੈਜ਼ੈਂਸ ਮੁੜ ਕੇ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਆ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਮਤਲਬ ਉਹ ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪ ਨੂੰ ਰੀਇਨਵੈਂਟ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਕਰ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇੰਪੀਰੀਅਲਿਸਟ ਨੈਰੇਟਿਵਸ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਕਮਾਲ ਦਾ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਸੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਨੇ ਐਕਸਪਲੋਰ ਕਰਨਾ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤਾ। ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਜਦੋਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਆਇਆ, ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਦੋਸਤ ਨੇ ਸੁਜੈਸਟ ਕੀਤਾ ਵੀ ਜਰਨਲ ਆਫ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਸਟੱਡੀਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਓਬਰਾਏ ਬਾਰੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਦਾ ਆਰਟੀਕਲ ਛਪਿਆ। ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਲਈ ਉਹ ਆਰਟੀਕਲ ਪੁਰਾਣਾ ਜਾਂ ਪਹਿਲਾ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ, ਪਰ ਮੈਂ ਸਟਰੋਂਗਲੀ ਰਿਕਮੈਂਡ ਕਰਦਾ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ। ਉਹ ਬੜਾ ਕਮਾਲ ਦਾ ਆਰਟੀਕਲ ਆ। ਔਰੈਲਿਟੀ ਤੇ ਟੈਕਸਚੁਅਲਿਟੀ ਬਾਰੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਡਿਸਕਸ਼ਨ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਆਰਟੀਕਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਹ ਅੱਜ ਤੱਕ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਈ ਹੋਰ ਕਿਤੇ। ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਛਪੀ, ਐਡੀਟਡ ਵੋਲਿਊਮ ਸੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਸ਼ੈਕਲ ਤੇ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਗੁਰਹਰਪਾਲ ਸਿੰਘ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ। ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਆਰਟੀਕਲ ਛਪਿਆ ਮੈਕਲੌਡ ਤੇ ਹੇਗਲ ਦੇ ਕ੍ਰਿਟੀਕ ਦੇ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ। ਉਹ ਆਰਟੀਕਲ ਮੈਂ ਪੜ੍ਹਿਆ। ਫਿਰ ਮੇਰਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਨਾਲ 2004 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੰਟੈਕਟ ਹੋਇਆ। ਫਿਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸਿਸ ਆਰਗੇਨਾਈਜ਼ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ ਹੌਫਸਟਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹ ਅਟੈਂਡ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ। ਫਿਰ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਰਕਲੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸਿਸ ਆਰਗੇਨਾਈਜ਼ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ। ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ, ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਭੋਗਲ, ਡਾਕਟਰ ਗੁਰਹਰਪਾਲ ਸਿੰਘ, ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਪਾਲ ਸਿੰਘ ਆਹਲੂਵਾਲੀਆ, ਇਹ ਸਾਰੇ ਆਏ ਉੱਥੇ ਤੇ ਸਾਡੀ ਸੰਗਤ ਬਣੀ। ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਮਿਸ਼ੀਗਨ 'ਚ ਇਵੈਂਟ ਹੋਏ ਤੇ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਸਾਡਾ ਇੰਟਰੈਕਸ਼ਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਚੱਲ ਰਿਹਾ। ਇਹਦੇ ਦਰਮਿਆਨ ਹੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਨੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਫਾਰਮੇਸ਼ਨ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤਾ, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਿ ਬਹੁਤ ਕਮਾਲ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸ਼ੁਰੂਆਤ ਸੀ। ਸੋ ਰਿਲੀਜਨ ਇੰਸਪੈਕਟਰ ਆਫ ਦ ਵੈਸਟ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਤੇ ਆਧਾਰਿਤ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਦਾ ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਹੋਣਾ, ਇਟਸ ਅ ਪਾਇਨੀਅਰਿੰਗ ਵਰਕ ਇਨ ਸਿੱਖ ਸਟੱਡੀਜ਼। ਇਹ ਕੰਮ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨਵੇਂ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟਸ ਸਕਾਲਰਸ ਆ, ਉਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਨਵੀਆਂ ਟ੍ਰੈਜੈਕਟਰੀਜ਼ ਐਕਸਪਲੋਰ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਆ। ਪਰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਬੁਨਿਆਦੀ ਇੰਟੈਰੋਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੋਈ ਰਿਲੀਜਨ ਇੰਸਪੈਕਟਰ ਆਫ ਦ ਵੈਸਟ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਲੋਨੀਅਲ ਪ੍ਰੋਸੈਸ ਆਫ ਟ੍ਰਾਂਸਲੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੈ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲ ਹੋਈ, ਉਹ ਬੁਨਿਆਦੀ ਥਿਓਰੈਟੀਕਲ ਪੁਆਇੰਟ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਆ ਉਹ ਉਹਨੇ ਸਾਰੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਸਟੱਡੀਜ਼ ਨੂੰ ਟਰਾਂਸਫਾਰਮ ਕਰਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡਾ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਪਾਇਆ। ਤੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਰਾਹ ਵੱਖੋ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਆ, ਪਰ ਉਹ ਗੱਲ ਮੈਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਰੱਖਦੀ। ਮੈਂ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਕਹਿਣੀ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਮਤਲਬ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਦੇ ਕੰਮ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਲਾਹਾ ਲਿਆ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਤਲਬ ਉਹਦੇ ਚੋਂ ਬੜੀ ਸੇਧ ਮਿਲੀ ਹੈ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਤੇ ਉਹ ਉਸ ਕੰਟਰੀਬਿਊਸ਼ਨ ਲਈ, ਉਸ ਪਾਇਨੀਅਰਿੰਗ ਵਰਕ ਲਈ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਗ੍ਰੇਟਫੁਲ ਹਾਂ। ਅੱਜ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ ਨੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਟਾਈਮ ਕੱਢਿਆ ਤੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਮਤਲਬ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਮੌਕਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਅਸੀਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦੀ ਹਾਂ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਰੇ ਜੁੜੇ ਆ, ਤੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਦੀ ਇੰਟਰੋਡਕਸ਼ਨ ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪਹਿਲਾ ਚੈਪਟਰ ਉਹ ਪੜ੍ਹੋ। ਇਹ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਹੈ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਉਹ ਮੈਸੇਜ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲਿਆ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਬਾਅਦ 'ਚ ਵੀ ਜੇ ਪੜ੍ਹਨੀ ਚਾਹੋ, ਇਹ ਮੈਂ ਹਾਈਲੀ ਰਿਕਮੈਂਡ ਕਰਦਾ। ਤੇ ਆਈ ਵੁੱਡ ਇਨਵਾਈਟ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਮੰਡੇਰ to begin the talk, and then we'll have our discussion session after the talk. Thank you. ਹਾਂਜੀ ਬਸ।
ਹਾਂਜੀ, ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਜੀ। ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ। ਦੋਨੇ ਪ੍ਰਭ ਸ਼ਰਨ ਭਰਾਵਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਮੈਂ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਦਿਆਂ ਹਾਂ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਬੜੀ ਸਪੋਰਟ ਕੀਤੀ ਕਈ ਸਾਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ, ਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਇੰਟਰਸਟ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੰਮ ਨੂੰ ਫੋਲੋ ਕੀਤਾ। ਸੋ ਆਈ ਐਮ ਰੀਅਲੀ ਗ੍ਰੇਟਫੁਲ। ਬੋਲਣਾ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ 'ਚ ਵੀ ਮੈਂ ਬੋਲ ਸਕਦਾ ਇਹ ਜੇ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ, ਪਰ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੇਰੇ ਖਿਆਲ ਥੋੜੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਨਾ ਕਹਿ ਲਓ ਵੀ ਸ਼ਾਰਪਨੈਸ ਆ ਸਕਦੀ ਆ। ਸੋ ਮੈਂ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਮੈਂ ਬੋਲੂੰਗਾ, ਤੇ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਲੋੜ ਹੋਈ ਮੈਂ ਉੱਥੇ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਵਿਚ ਕਰ ਜਾਊਂਗਾ ਜੇ ਲੋੜ ਪਈ ਤਾਂ। otherwise we'll just do this. So thank you for asking everybody to read the two articles, Interdictions and Religion in the Spectre of the West. You kind of forced me to go back to this book, which I kind of left behind well over a decade, I think almost 14 years, and I haven't been back to it since. And it was a painful process reading the book. So I can just imagine how painful it was for everybody else as well. And it's painful for a number of reasons. It was really hard to get a kind of a fix on the intellectual environment that we as Sikhs were actually in. And that's what I'm going to try and explain. Rather than give you an overview of the book, I don't need to do that. What I will do is go into a few of the things that I'm finding interesting now, as I've moved well beyond that particular era of writing. But I still think there's some really interesting stuff there, particularly in the way that I formulated it in those days. That is all sort of coming to pass today in the way we look at international politics and stuff. And I'm going to make allusions to all of that in the talk. So a lot of this is just filling in some of the gaps and highlighting the things that are becoming more relevant or have become more relevant over the last 14 years or so. So I'm going to start by just sharing the screen. Do I have permission to do this? I wonder if you could make me a co-host.
I can do
something.
Okay. Yes. You are a co-host now.
Yeah, I'll just try that again. Here we go. I actually did a Prezi, but I'm going to use the PDF from the Prezi. There's something that's gone wrong. But the things I want to talk about is, first of all, the chapter on interdictions and chapters 1 and 2 in Religion and the Spectre of the West really are looking at the theoretical underpinnings of the Western imaginary. And a lot of people have criticized me for spending so much time on unearthing and bringing into view the kind of Western imaginary, particularly from the standpoint of the subaltern subject. But as I've read the book, and I think in light of everything that's happening in the world, I think it's even more important. If I had to write the book again, I would double down and put an extra chapter on the whole relationship between current politics, contemporary politics, the way that politics has repeated itself over the last 200 or 300 years, and the intellectual trajectory, the whole sort of intellectual sphere. And there's a deep relationship between realpolitik, which is this first bubble here, and the intellectual formation of the West. And I'll explain that in a second. So to really understand Spectre of the West, first of all, I just want to say I had no intention of writing that book. This was not my project. I was not a fan of religious studies. I actually went into philosophy in the philosophy department at the University of Warwick. And my dissertation topics, both at MA and PhD level, were both called Thinking Between Cultures. I was more interested in taking the concepts of Gurbani, for example, and putting them into contact with a philosophical realm, because I was more interested in doing what is now called world philosophies, and seeing how Sikh concepts did not fit into Indian philosophy, and at the same time didn't necessarily fit into a world philosophy's framework. So what I was doing, as well as Thinking Between Cultures, which was a project in comparative philosophy, I was actually exploring the nature of the contact zone between non-Western and Western concepts as they were coming into encounter. And this was both a psychological project. It was something that was happening in my mind, and also something that happens on texts, right? So as well as the objective textual process, I was really interested in how I make the decisions when translating something into English, or vice versa, translating from English into Punjabi. And that translation zone, or the contact zone between cultures, was really, really at the forefront of my sort of endeavors at the time. And as I was looking at the encounter between Gurmat and Western concepts, I began to experience what I borrowed this term from Derrida, began to experience interdiction, meaning that I felt that I was prohibited from expressing the force of non-Western concepts, in my case, Gurmat, except through the rules of Western philosophy. And as I kept doing this, even though I was trying to do a comparative project, I kept running into a policing mechanism. So just hold on to that phrase there, policing mechanism. Basically a device that controlled what counts as thought. So when people just are doing philosophy or comparative philosophy, you think, yeah, I'm thinking, I'm in my space, and this is the space of my mind, and it's free. I'm autonomous. nothing can get me here. So if I want to think about or do vichar on, say, Gurbani or even Indian philosophy or whatever, this space is intact. But it wasn't. That was the whole point. That the very thought process and the realm of thought in which we're all imbricated, something else was controlling it, and something else continues to control it. And that, it was bugging me. I couldn't figure out what it was at the time. But as I began to study it, I borrowed a term from in my new book. Whatever, I've really brought this out in the new book called Geophilosophical Encounters. It's what Deleuze calls the dogmatic image of thought. In other words, thought has become dogmatic, not only in the West, but through colonization, that dogmatism has been transferred to all other cultures. And it's this dogmatic image of thought, this controlling mechanism, this policing mechanism, which was governing my thinking. It governs both common sense, but also the global arena of thought. And in a sense, there's this kind of unspoken assumption behind it that amounts to the assertion of sovereignty. And that was what the title of the book, Religion and the Spectre of the West, was all about. It's this spectral sovereignty. It's sovereignty that's unspoken and yet has a immensely hegemonic and powerful influence. So sovereignty, this is not just an intellectual issue, but it was grounded in very much in a real politic, which was unfolding in front of my eyes, in front of everybody's eyes, in fact. And so this interdiction at the local level, at the level of thinking, corresponded also to political historical events. And I'm talking about events that happened over the past 200-300 years, but also events that were unfolding in the past 20 years, and particularly 9/11. And I think it's coming to America and the 9/11 situation, which really brought the spectrality of this notion of sovereignty into vogue for me. And I began to visualize it more strongly. But the sovereignty at the same time was also undergoing crisis, especially since 9/11. And 9/11 was both a political moment in which sovereignty is re-exerted all over the world, but it's also a moment in which sovereignty itself, the very concept of sovereignty, the spectrality of sovereignty, suddenly becomes visible to everybody. And it sort of coincides with the return of the sovereign as an extra legal kind of figure. And I've just drawn this just to show what's going on. So the kind of sovereignty that I was feeling was actually a crisis of sovereignty. And that crisis was being felt from within my own subjectivity, as well as in relation to the kind of politics that was going on. Now, we normally think of sovereignty as mainly political sovereignty. If you look at the left-hand side, we tend to think of it as state sovereignty, right? That's what we're supposed to think about. So what I was noticing was that there is also a crisis of the state, a crisis of the law happening. Post 9/11 brought this into kind of into visibility a lot more. And the nature of the political sovereignty was actually the exertion of a global nationalization, or in other words, everything that was global was also nationalized as well, or becoming nationalized. And since 9/11, this is exactly what's happened in the political realm. That what we're seeing with the reversion of all of these so-called liberal democratic states and liberalism itself, the shift towards nationalization is actually the breaking down of a certain kind of sovereignty. Now, I don't want to go into that too much in much detail here, but there is a different sort of sovereignty. And the one that was particularly bugging me in the Thinking Between Cultures project was a sovereignty that still remains invisible to most scholars, to politicians, to people in the street, and that's epistemic sovereignty, which I think is a kind of a parent sovereignty to political sovereignty. In other words, you can't have political sovereignty unless there is something called epistemic sovereignty. And that's the sovereignty of the modern knowledge system. In other words, modernity, as it comes into being by creating a hold on knowledge, and knowledge that humans create by making everything in the world into an object, right? So modernity is not just the newness of things, but it's the dataization of all nature, of everything that exists. And that knowledge system, that modern knowledge system, because it's intertwined with the state and with political sovereignty, often goes below the radar. So this is the one we need to really focus our attention on. And I couldn't state it in these terms exactly, but this was the kind of sovereignty that I was trying to deconstruct in Religion and the Spectre of the West. And I couldn't quite see it exactly in these terms, but I'm kind of, with the benefit of hindsight, it just becomes clearer. And this modern knowledge system, MKS here, I'm going to borrow this term from subaltern studies from the late 1980s, early 90s, and they divided colonial rule, the colonial infrastructure into several different idioms, and the first idiom, the second idiom, and the third idiom. And the first idiom is the language, conceptuality, the thought process of the modern knowledge system. So those things all go together: language, conceptuality, and thought process, basically what we call the intellectual framework itself. So that's the first idiom. So it works by, in the case of the British imperialism, and the first idiom is essentially English language imperialism. It's entirely captured within the concept of race. And then there is Christian secularity. And all three of these things weave together to make up the fabric of the first idiom. So the first idiom is basically that which is sovereign. So when I use the term sovereignty or the crisis of sovereignty, it's all to do with this first idiom. That's what I'm going to be kind of critiquing. And when we ask the question, what exactly is thinking, what is thought, when we get our thought process to reflect on itself, it almost never is able to bring the first idiom into view. The moment you bring it into view, you bring thinking itself into crisis, okay? But the first idiom primarily is also responsible for the nature of the global arena of thought as a global nationalized thought system. And primarily it works by restricting entry of non-Western concepts, non-Western cultures, non-Western peoples. So it's like an immigration process, right? It basically, there's an unspoken sign which says immigrants not allowed. I mean, that's how this first idiom worked. It worked like that in the colonial era, and it continues to work like that now. And that's how sovereignty is kind of exerted. So the first idiom, what I do want to say is that my claim in Religion and the Spectre of the West, through this concept of interdiction, was that the first idiom was the cause of an immense cathexis from colonized languages, cultures, and concepts to English language, to European thought, to philosophy. That's what's going on in the interdictions chapter, and also in the first two chapters of Religion and the Spectre of the West. I didn't use the word cathexis. I used the word disorders of identity. And I'll explain a little bit about what's kind of going on there. But the other word that I used was translation. So just remember this. So the cathexis that I'm talking about, the first idiom is the cause of this huge cathexis from colonized languages, colonized cultures and concepts to the first idiom, which is English language, European thought, and primarily philosophy. Okay, the idiom of philosophy. Now, cathexis, let me just define that very briefly. So cathexis is, it's a term that Freud uses early in his work. It's when you transfer your mental energy, your life force, your libido from, let's say, the non-Western or indigenous thought and language to Western thought and language, to the English language imperialism. So it's the transfer of one's, I don't know any other word to sort of use for this, actually. It's politically, it's like transferring one's loyalty from one state to another. But this is a psychological transfer. So it's psychological energy. Everything that's invested in your being part of one particular culture is now transferred without you knowing it. It's transferred unconsciously to the dominant system. You don't even know that it's happened. That's cathexis here. That's how I'm gonna, and that's also the work of sovereignty. That's how sovereignty works inside our beings, basically. I mean, I think Foucault talks about this. There's lots of different analysis here, but it's actually quite a simple process. It's a trick that it performs through giving us concepts like freedom and stuff like that. But let me talk about this in a little bit more detail. Just going on to the next slide. So what I'm going to talk about, this restricted entry, interdiction, cathexis, sovereignty, it's all the same thing. So that's what I'm doing in the first two chapters of Religion and the Spectre of the West. In that interdiction chapter, I am tracking interdiction. But tracking this interdiction, tracking cathexis is really difficult. You can't do it objectively, or you can, but you'd have to write many, many books. Most people have tried to do it through empirical studies, writing genealogies of what's happening. But for me, it was more of a kind of a detection game. And it was guided by my own intuition, where what I learned to do was to harness my own subjectivity, my own memories of growing up in England, growing up in moving my psychological subjectivity, my being, from Punjabi, speaking Punjabi in the house, living Punjabi thought, to doing the same in English in the same time. So most kids growing up in the West just aren't aware of this process at all. They completely submerge one aspect of their being under the dominant idiom, which is basically English, etc. And a lot of people, a lot of parents facilitate this by saying, "Chal beta English vich bol le," and that the subaltern side remains completely subalternized. But funnily enough, I was always aware of this as I was growing up from a young age. I think from 4 years old, from 3 or 4 years old, I just had this kind of ability to just remove myself from certain situations and think on it, submerge it, and then move on. But I kept moving between two cultures, and I didn't know what made me do that. Now I know. And I would say now that whole process of moving cathexis, going from one to the other, and then de-cathecting, is all pushed by what we call affect, what we call emotion. So the strongest emotion in me growing up, and I recognize this only decades later, was probably shame, right? The shame, let's say, when I was really young, that when I walked with my parents in public, my parents had strong Punjabi accents, etc. And there's part of me wishing, why can't you speak as well as these Gore, all that kind of stuff? It's very childish things. But you think about it, it builds a kind of affect inside you, and that affect is very, very strong. The strength of these affects I cannot even begin to kind of talk about here. It's a huge topic in itself. So essentially, what I was doing in Religion and the Spectre of This was kind of delving back into my memories, my psychological existence, making existential connections, but making them not just for the sake of doing a kind of self-reflection, but connecting back 100 years, realizing that the native elites, that the people in the Singh Sabha period, Indian elites who encountered the British for the first time and were seeing their entire cultures shift, being transferred and translated into English language imperialism, that they surely must have undergone tremendous degree of psychological disempowerment, but also transferal at the same time. So something was happening. It was not a clean process at all. And the reason I guessed that was that if I could feel it happening now, 100 years later, what on earth could they have been feeling at that time? So my whole sort of way of connecting with them was not just memory, but actually memory powered by feeling. And I'm happy to talk about that later, if you wish. So it's that sort of feeling, that connection that made me realize it led to certain questions, such as, how did indigenous elites convert to modernity? And I use the word convert from Peter van der Veer's work, where he also says early in his kind of trajectory that these native elites in the late 19th century didn't just accept modernity, they were literally converted to it. So it's like a religious conversion process, except that it's not religious conversion, it's a secularization. And this is how secularization works, right? Same process as the missionaries were doing, but it's through secularization. So how did they enter into the modern knowledge system? And not just talking about people, but talking about categories and concepts. How did indigenous categories or concepts come to recognize the modern knowledge system as epistemically sovereign? How do they recognize the global arena of thought as something that was neutral, where you just kind of encounter concepts in a kind of transparent process? How was the sovereignty and indigenous categories transferred to the modern knowledge system? Again, the answer to that I've given you. It's this sort of system of cathexis, which is really important to look at. Now, for me, writing Spectre of the West was a methodological issue. To be counted as a scholar who was critical of his own process of writing, one had to both do objective study, and yet I was bringing in all this subjective stuff as well. It was a tremendous risk. It was a risk to take because you have to be careful especially if you're standing for tenure. These kind of things can come in under tremendous criticism, if you're unlucky, and it has happened to a lot of people as well. But anyway, so there's objectively, you can study it by looking at the colonial machinery, education system, law. You can dig into the empirical studies, do historical studies, and that's all well and good, you know. And theoretically, people have kind of used Foucauldian genealogy and other processes to kind of bolster the objective understanding of this. But a lot of this, as I said, I was trying to do subjectively. So that's where all of this interpreting the interpretive process comes in. That's the title of the article that Prof Sharon referred to earlier, the critique of Harjot Oberoi's book. One of Oberoi's very important chapters was called The Interpretive Process. In other words, he was also interested in what was happening in the minds of these of the Singh Sabha elites during the colonial period. What I did was turn that on its head and say, is it then possible to interpret the interpretive process itself, to take a reflection back? So what was happening within the native mind? How did they become subjected to new imperial categories? All of these categories are working there: race, religion, language, and freedom. And everything is happening under the force of law, colonial British law, basically, the law of empire, etc. And all of this goes into creating the modern nationalist imaginary. And just as a kind of an aside, I would say that if I had to change the title of chapter 1, is it, or chapter 2 in, I think it's chapter 1 in Spectre of the West, I called it monotheolingualism. I would now call it monotheolingual racialism or racism, simply because I did highlight racism, but if I were to rewrite it again, I would kind of make that center stage, because the way that the first idiom works, it's all inflected by racial and religious categories in a way that both race and religion work together to inflect what we understand as reason. So reason is not just reason per se, it's racialized reason, it's racialized, religionized reason. And all of that is kind of working its way into the dominant language of the time. So the conventional wisdom that I had to kind of butt heads against and had to critique was the idea that, you know, the native elites underwent a kind of a benign civilizing, modernizing kind of process, that they were naturally modernized by being educated in English. So in other words, there was a kind of a benign communication going on between colonizer and colonized, you know, this idea of dialogue, and that they collaborated with each other. And that because of this collaboration and dialogue, there is a neutral transfer of knowledge across these cultural boundaries, across linguistic boundaries, where nothing really happens. It's just data from one culture is transferred to another culture and nothing happens. It's fine. But translation is much more problematic than that. And that's partly what Spectre of the West was trying to uncover. And what I've argued, and what I would argue even more strongly now, is that all of this conventional wisdom is happening largely due to the ideology of liberalism. So everything that I've said previously in these previous slides could just be tagged under ideology of liberalism, basically, liberal modernity, etc. And liberalism performs a con trick. And that's essentially what those two chapters are trying to tell you, that it's basically tricking us, that the narrative of benign modernization is a liberal deceit, basically. It's an illusion. It deceived the indigenous elites into believing that they're on the same playing field, even when they're situated in their homeland, in Punjab, working in Punjabi. Nothing is outside or was outside the mediation of English language imperialism. Even the most the densest form of Punjabi writing at the time. Even when you don't use a single word of English, etc. Then the reason is that the thought process on which colonized cultures are entering into a world, that new world makes the rules, basically. So there is, there is a mediation going on there, but it remains invisible. And that's what I've been trying to kind of get at here. So there is a deceit, there is a forgetting on the part of the native elites that we're already within the knowledge, the modern knowledge system. And colonization is perpetuated through our tacit recognition of the first idiom. So it's this first idiom, I think, that's really important, and that those two chapters have tried to forefront, basically the invisibility of Western hegemony. And the whole academic process, the whole political process doesn't want you to see that. The moment you can see that, the moment you can see how the machinery works. And so you make decisions in a different way. And in that way, you compromise the sovereignty of the colonizer. That's essentially what I'm trying to get across here. So let's just go on to cathexis now. In a minute. We'll come to cathexis in a minute, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the colonial idioms. Can you all read this clearly? Even the small print, I hope you can. But
yes, we can read it.
Great. So what I'm trying to do, if you think about the 6 chapters of Religion in the Spectre of the West, chapters 1 and 2 are all about the first idiom, which is the hidden invisibility of the Western imaginary. The second idiom is chapters 3 and 4, which is talking about encounter, how Indologists encountered native elites, how the modern and the non-modern come into contact, how the Western and the Indic sort of come together. And then the third idiom is actually chapters 4 and 5, is how the nationalist idiom comes out. And that's the result of this encounter, is the idiom of nationalism. So Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, which was created through the Reform movement. So you're well aware of this, that the reformist and the traditionalist elements, basically. I won't go into this much in detail here, since we're not talking about chapters 3 and 4. But it's the first idiom that we're going to focus on. And the first idiom is essentially the Western imaginary. It's what I've called the English Orthopedia. So you read a section called the English Orthopedia. It's how English language imperialism is pushed through educational mechanisms, which are backed by state, by law, and obviously by the supremacy of this language system. Much of that work occurs in the work of Indologists. So Indology is central here. And there are 2 different phases of the first idiom that we see it, certainly in India. And I called them Orientalism 1 and Orientalism 2. And I think I'm still right in that. That was the correct move, because I think everything I've read since then has kind of borne this out, that there was definitely a movement from Orientalism 1, the earlier phase of Indological writings, which had a very Kantian Enlightenment feel to them. And within 50 years, they give way to Orientalism 2. And what we're seeing in this shift from Orientalism 1 to Orientalism 2 is a shift of the West, of Europe, towards nationalism, much in the way that we have seen the entire world move towards nationalism in the 2020s. We've seen the same thing happen in the 1920s and the same thing happen in the 1820s. So every 100 years or so, this reversion to massive nationalism seems to occur in the West. And that's what I'm trying to get at here, is that the nature of Indology itself completely changed. And the reason it changed is that it now is undergirded by a different intellectual structure, which is a combination of historicism. It's a new theory of time. okay, and a new theory of the comparative, of how to bring different cultural concepts into encounter without compromising the sovereignty of the first idiom, the sovereignty of the West. Okay, so that's the whole thing. This is the policing mechanism, how it works by comparison. So I'm going to show you how that sort of comparison works in a second. Let's go to the next slide. Just take a look at this for a second. What exactly is happening here? What I'm doing here is visualizing the first idiom. And I gave a glimpse of this in chapters 1, but especially in chapter 2. What I've done here is embellish this with a different strand, which is America. In the book, in Spectre of the West, I focus mostly on England and Europe between the 1760s and the 1860s, showing how the first idiom comes into being, right? So there are 5 phases, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's just my interpretation. Don't go looking for this in secondary literature or where you won't find it. It's just my interpretation. The reason I added America is that I'm teaching a course. I've been teaching 2 different courses at Michigan. One is called Race, Caste, and Religion in the United States and India, where I'm looking at the rise of fascism in India and the United States, and I'm looking at them in tandem. So you can't talk about Aryan race theory without considering India and caste theory. They go together. So and also America is a really interesting addition here to the trajectory, the development of the modern Western imaginary here, and we shouldn't exclude it. So if I had to write Spectre of the West again, I'd probably do more work bringing in America here. So the phases are basically the creation of the secular nation state, and which is empowered by the whole Enlightenment process. But as soon as Enlightenment comes to maturity in the early 18th century, there is also a massive revival of Christianity. So that's what's happening in the movement from Orientalism 1 to Orientalism 2. Within those 50 years, the nature of the Western imaginary is beginning to change. And it's partly changing because colonization is so successful. That's on the one hand. But the other hand is that knowledge of these cultures that they were colonizing was coming back into the Western universities. And as it was coming back into the Western universities, there's always the danger that these concepts of Chinese cultures, Indic cultures can affect and come into contact with the Western classics, with Western philosophy in particular. And once they come into contact, you have to create a playing field where the Western thought system remains dominant, right? So that philosophy itself is never compromised. And that's essentially what's happening. So you see this realpolitik again. The realpolitics is colonization and the restructuring of the Western imaginary in a new way. That's happening in stages 2 and 3. And alongside the realpolitik is the epistemic sovereignty that I talked about earlier. That's all happening here as well. So what I'm trying to show is there's a real shift away from the kind of Kantian, Lockean Enlightenment towards a new phase of Enlightenment that's largely powered with the thought process of people like Hegel. And incidentally, I would double down. If I had to write this again, I would double down. It's absolutely right to bring Hegel into view at that time. I was largely going by guesswork at the time, my own readings of philosophy, but everything that I've learned since then has convinced me that this was absolutely right, and I would do it even more strongly now. So that you can see where all of this is going. So phase 3, say slavery, civil war, capitalism in America. You see colonialism, nationalism, and the imagination of Europe here. And with England, it's just on its own. It's kind of doing its own empire thing in India. Here's the move from Orientalism 1 to Orientalism 2, always in tandem with race theory. And that's also partly fueling the shift from Orientalism 1 to Orientalism 2 and to the modern understanding of the West. It's based largely on race. So even language is racially inflected, religion is racially inflected, and race is religiously inflected as well. So the two categories are completely intertwined, right? So when you think about language, you think about religion, Christianity, and you think about Aryan race. Why are the three things just as strong now as they were 200 years ago? It's because of everything that's happening here. It's all to do with sovereignty being tied up within these really inextricable structures, basically. And so what I try to do is to show that it's really with Hegel that we come to the understanding of the global arena of thought, world historical consciousness, this idea of the Christian secular continuum. Why does secularism always work in the West, and why does it always seem to favor European cultures and never favor cultures that come from outside? It's largely because it's tied to Christianity and to kind of secularism. So what we understand as white supremacy, the West, the global idea of race, all comes out of this very, very well-knit understanding, and that's really the first idiom. So if you try to push this into the background, saying, yeah, it's not important, like most of the a lot of the white scholars have done this, but also Marxists as well. They're really wonderful at doing this. They just completely marginalize looking at the first idiom in this kind of detail. And that's, incidentally, I did try to bring that into vogue as well. This is just a closer look at it. But basically, this is why I wanted you to kind of think about that these two things comprise the first idiom. And just to give you an idea of how things changed from Kant to Hegel, I just put these, I share these in my race course. With Kant, he had obviously he wasn't the repository of such detailed knowledge that Hegel was, say, 40 years later. Kant's division of humanity was into like the Native Americans, give way through evolution, through some kind of teleological process of reasoning, to the Negro race, to the Hindus, and to the white race. And these are terms that Kant himself used. And it's interesting, you listen to Kant's language, and everything is working through the lack of affect or having affect. So Native Americans, basically, they don't even have emotion. They don't have affect. They have no passion. They're lazy. The Negro race, as he calls it, has a little bit of affect. It has a little bit of passion. They're trainable, so you can train them to become slaves, etc. But ultimately, that's as far as they can go. And then there's this race that he calls the Hindus. Now, he's probably talking about Indians or South Asians, and they have more of the emotive capability. And then you come to the white race, which is Europeans. They have all of these things, including reason and the full development of reason. What you don't have is a fully developed understanding of history here. So Kant is trying to put this understanding of humanity onto a kind of comparative grid, but he doesn't have the tools to do that. So it's very, very basic when at his level. By the time you come to Hegel, so we're talking about the first idiom, remember? I haven't shifted focus from that. You have a much better developed understanding of what other cultures have brought to the comparative process. So you have now, Hegel actively talks about Africa, China, India, Greece, Rome, Europe, which becomes the kind of baseline for the development of history. And he maps onto that in different lecture series, different religions as well. Again, I won't go into it in too much detail, but you can see here that he's developing what Kant didn't develop, which was a kind of a master-slave dialectic. And that master-slave dialectic is basically how different cultures come into historical consciousness. And that's underpinned by differing understandings of the concept of God. Okay, so when I said earlier I was really interested in looking at the contact zone between different cultures, Hegel was as well. But for him, the contact zone is determined by master-slave dialectic, historical consciousness, and obviously differing concepts of God. So not everybody can achieve the understanding of God that Europeans achieved. And the Europeans achieved the most advanced understanding of God because they were able to overcome God, to kill God, which creates the secular state. And so they have something that no other culture has. But what I'm trying to get across to you is that it's this broad understanding which becomes eventually the global arena of thought. And it looks complicated, but it's actually very simple. On the right-hand side, you have basically, it's racial. It's a racial comparative grid. Aryan races in this direction and non-Aryan races, those that are unfree as opposed to those that are free. And this maps not only into a kind of anthropology, but even more importantly, into how philosophy as a discipline keeps its sovereignty. And that remains in place today. And that's what I was trying to do in the mid-90s. With the thinking between cultures. And that's what came into religion and the spectre of the West. It kind of had to come there. Now, I've just added one last thing here, which is that Hegel's really important, what he bequeaths to his readers is an understanding of how nations come into being. And come into being through affect. So what he's talking about here is two different kinds of national affect. National affect one is the colonizer's affect, which works. So the colonizer's affect is determined primarily by pride, by superiority. They're having been in control. National affect two is how colonized cultures feel in relation to subjugation. So you would have to have shame, abjection. Think of all the negative emotions here. So when people read history or comparative history, you're meant to feel differently about your particular nation. So A, you know which nation you belong to. B, you know where your nation exists on the historical grid, and it's tagged with a particular national affect. So when we talk about nations, there is a kind of a grading in terms of how you're meant to feel in relation to the modern sovereign, which is obviously the first idiom, the Western imaginary, etc., etc. And the point of all of this is to exert a kind of panoptic control. So I don't believe that Hegel read Bentham's Panopticon. He might have done. I hadn't seen evidence of that. But we see a really sophisticated understanding of how panopticons work by creating a kind of God's eye view from the colonial point of view of colonized cultures. And the whole thing is to exert some kind of control, with the Christian secular continuum remaining in absolute static place here as the kind of peacemaking entity, right? And all the trouble in the world goes on elsewhere outside of that. So that's just a way of kind of thinking about that. Another way of kind of thinking about this movement, especially from Kant to Hegel, and how important it is for contemporary politics, is that this is all still within the frame of liberalism. So what Hegel took from Kant was a form of liberalism which he simply historicized. And out of that come the two major movements of contemporary politics, the left movement and the right movement. The left is Marxism, it gives rise to communism, and it remains militantly secular. And on the other side, you have, obviously, remember Orientalism too? This is where it all comes from. It's basically bringing Christianity back into the sovereign idiom itself. So it gives rise to democratic liberalism and this whole sort of understanding of democracy and the interplay of the religious and the secular. Combining both of them, however, is an understanding of reason as racialized or racialized reason. And that's really important to understand. There's no such thing as simple reason in itself. In the hands of these people, it was racialized. It was racialized in so that other forms of reasoning could never knock out the position of the sovereign. Where am I now? Okay, so let's. I haven't even come to cathexis and cathexis, but let me just sum up in 2 or 3 slides here. So why was the first idiom so important? First of all, it exerts invisible systemic violence, the violence that becomes embedded into state institutions through language and thought processes. It's also important because of this conversion to secular modernity. It's not an easy movement. It's actually a conversion. And it's something that restructures the indigenous relationships to language. And I talked about the invention of the mother tongue and this belief in monotheolingual racism, which is all sort of part of the global idea of nationalism. And that is essentially a term for the global fiduciary. So the global fiduciary is this belief system that we can transfer our sovereignty of our concepts, etc., safely in another language, in another thought process, within the global arena of the thought. And I think this process obviously happens only because you're being held at gunpoint, right? Colonialism didn't happen because white people came and they looked, they look cleaner than everybody else. It's because they had better guns, and end of story. And with better guns come the possibility of endless economic advantages for 200 years or so. But what this does is psychologically reorient the native elites through this cathexis to the West through English. So cathexis, just to summarize now, cathexis is this kind of contract perpetrated by empire so that you can manufacture consent from the native elites. Cathexis works by de-cathecting, transferring energy, psychological energy, from the native idiom to English. And the interesting thing is, English is not the final landing point. It's not the final object of cathexis. The final object is the understanding of the global, the understanding of the universal, the understanding of the West as global and universal, and therefore the understanding of modernity. So this is why we so naturally accept that we're all modern, right? It's because we've already cathected to it from the moment we learn language, whether we're born in Punjab or in India or in the West. It's that process which is so difficult to bring into visibility. This slide here, basically the global belief system or the fiduciary was essentially the cathectical things that's happening. So you transfer your belief system into this monotheolingual raciality, the idea of the West, and it's basically what moves national affect. So when we react to it, when we try to overturn it or question it, we do it primarily, firstly, through the idea of the nation and the nation state, by organizing ourselves through national affect. But the interesting thing is that that only strengthens the sovereignty of the West. the national affect that we use to resist. And this is Fanon's theory of colonialism as well. You know, Fanon and everybody else, that you can't sort of directly counter it with another national language or another national set of ideas or concepts or whatever. Something else has to come into place. You have to bring the sovereignty of that process into visibility, to bring it into crisis. How do you do that? And that's something that I'm exploring as a mode of resistance. That's, you know, it's always been a mode of resistance for me. But how do you resist the global fiduciary, this global system of national affect? How do you de-cathect? I was using in the Religion of the Spectre of the West book, using this disorders of identity, as I said, breaking down my own identity through memorialization, through memory, but keeping the multiplicity of my thought process intact. So I didn't break apart, I kept it intact. I'm also combating it through diasporization. Now, diasporization, you normally understand diaspora as, oh, it's what happens to people who are colonized, who have moved outside of India or their homeland. No, that's not what diasporization means for me. In the new book, in Geophilosophical Encounters, diasporization is the de-cathecting of the West. It's the de-cathecting of the West. It's basically diasporizing philosophy. It's diasporizing the Western sovereign thought process to make it look like what it actually is, which is actually just like a Roman diaspora. That's how Rome eventually collapsed under the weight of becoming a diaspora. It was just infiltrated by multiple processes, and the only way Rome was kind of resurrected was when it became Christianized in the Byzantine period. They kind of gave a sovereignty back by infusing Roman polytheism with Christian monotheism, right? So these processes are all connected. But I don't think you can sit here and say, oh, we have to wait till certain things happen. I think this diasporization process is not one that we should necessarily just be focused on in relation to ourselves. You have to diasporize dominant cultures. And I've just written an entire book on it. It'll take another year for it to come out, but that's what's happening here. And what I've also done is actually rethought what I talked about as translation. So I think about translation in completely different ways. And that's another thing I was trying to do in Spectre, was trying to come up with a model of translation which would stay true to my own sense of consciousness, my own sense of being. I think that's all I've got. Yeah, that is all I've got. I don't think there's anything else. There we go. All done. more confusion on your plates.
Thank you so much, Professor Mandair, for such a thoughtful talk. And we'll have questions, but before we have questions from the audience, I would request Professor Pogal to initiate the discussion. Professor Pogal.
Thank you, Prof. Shandy. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Great to see you again, Arvind, and great to listen to your lectures. Incredibly detailed and systematic in your approach of analysis. It's always really refreshing to see the studious analysis and dismantling of the Western intellectual imaginary. And there's just so much to comment upon in terms of what you've put onto the table is just an immense amount. Your books and your thinking is dense, and that's why I love them. I think that's what's really valuable and missing in a lot of literature is the lack of depth and the lack of sincerity in analysis. And I think you bring that very well into play. I was just wondering, there are a number of things that I'm just trying to connect with. One of them is to do with the master-slave dialectic and how that plays out within the academy itself in terms of production of disciplines. And so we have the notion of humanitas and anthropos, and how it is the master-slave is repeated within the structures of humanities itself. And this is what maintains your point about the unchallengeability of philosophy and the humanities in general, is because they've got a notion of man that is based upon a human, that is based upon humanitas, that's over and above the anthropos. And I think some number of decolonial scholars are looking at that interplay within the academy. And because we're in the academy and we're trying to, this is probably the only space in which this kind of interrogation and analysis can occur. We must be aware of the legacy within the academy as well of the intellectual global imaginary, how it shapes disciplines. And so ethnic studies, interdisciplinary studies, religion is already formed as a anthropos rather than a humanitas. And I think that is quite interesting as a space to speak out of. There are many good questions in the chat as well that Prof. Shandeep and Prof. Shambir can bring out in terms of the implication of any new theory that comes out, like decolonialism or post-colonialism, which you yourself have already charted, of the implication and imbrication of those very disciplines that are coming from the anthropos, but mimic humanitas, and eventually reinscribe the very hierarchy and binary that we get from the colonial encounter. So what kind of space do we have in terms of resisting is already implicated in that global Western epistemology. And so that makes our problem slippery and elusive, because we may think that we're thinking against the system when we've already been predicted by it. So I think what do we do in that context is to realize, which I know your later chapters and your other work come into play in terms of what resources do we have within our own traditions to resist this kind of subsumption, this assimilation. And I think I'm looking forward to your coming works where Sikhi, Gursikhi itself becomes an epistemic foundation from which to think, rather than only within the Western academy. And obviously you've done this in great detail in many of your works, where you talk about that translation, you talk about that encounter, and you talk about how Gursikhi in its own resources, even at the time of the Singh Sabha period, was able to resist this global fiduciary that you're sort of mapping out in such a wonderful detail, and how we can have multiple pronged approaches where we tap into those kinds of epistemologies of our own tradition. Not that we have one epistemology. I don't want to make it into an indigeneity that somehow is always pure and resists any kind of assimilation, as though somehow Sikhi is somehow unbelievably unique in that it can resist all forms of assimilation. I don't mean it in that way. I mean its orientation to engage on its own terms, because it's always engaging with the other. Gursikhi is made out of the fabric of what you could say is a certain kind of comparativism, and that it has its own notion of comparativism, that isn't based upon friend enemy, but friend friend. And I think that's a different notion of sovereignty, in which a relationality can arise and we have resources there, so that our engagement with the other can start to direct a different vision, enact a different kind of output there. There's much to be said. There's hands going up all over the place. So I think I just wanted to initiate the discussion, and so happy to see the old crew back together again in a way.
That was great. That was a really sharp and incisive sort of encapsulation, I think, and some really wonderful questions. Thank you, Dr. Bogle. Yeah, great to be back with all the old horses. Still got everybody seems to have their four legs intact, I think. So we'll gallop on. But just a quick response, and then we'll let others in as well. So yeah, I think that in the new book, I focus more squarely on the master-slave dialectic, and I've connected it more sharply to political theology. And I could have let go of the language of anthropos and humanitas, which is absolutely correct, but it's something that was done by Sakai and his crew, who were working with East Asian humanities, and in a very interesting way. It kind of worked in the Spectre book, but I think there's ways of getting straight from master-slave dialectic through critique of political theology, and straight onto where it affects the humanities and the modern knowledge system, which is basically the reproduction of the subject-object framework, right? That's essentially what anthropos and humanities was all about. Humanitas was all about. In other words, modern knowledge, and especially in the modern university system, replicates and keeps reproducing the subject-object binary. How do we break that? It keeps in play essentially a duality. For it to survive, duality is essential. So the question is, how do you break that duality and do it through your own sort of systems? I think the contemporary argument that's happening between post-colonialism and decolonial theory is an interesting one, because and you know this very well as well, but the decolonial schools coming out of South America and other places kind of pushed back on post-colonial theory in very much in the same way that I did in the Spectre book as well. So even though I have post-coloniality in the title, it was actually a critique of secular post-colonial thought. And I think to give a quick answer to this, I think that the only thing to do to stop this kind of automatic cathexis going on is to change the playing field as such. And I think that I have two answers to this, and one is kind of like my easy academic answer. The other is more problematic, but I did state it in the very last chapter of Spectre in the West. And I think it's connected to two things. I think we, as a group, and many other groups, multiple other groups in the academy, are pushing on this to try and change the playing field. And I think it's not just us who are realizing this. We have many friends throughout the academy who are kind of working in similar ways. That's one thing. But I will say that it's not going to happen. None of this is going to happen. The academy isn't going to change without a change in the global order of things. Okay. I said this 4 months ago, back in April at the United Nations. There was a really interesting meeting that we had in New York. And I can go into that sort of later as well. But at the end of Religion and the Spectre of the West, my whole thing was this structure remains intact if the current global order remains intact. What we are seeing since 9/11, however, is a slow shift away. The ship is beginning to turn in a different direction. We are moving from a unilateral sovereign system towards what will eventually become, I think, a multipolar system. It's going to be messy, but that's going to affect macro global processes such as who has a table, who has a seat at the UN, right? And once the structure of the UN changes and those kind of structures change, I think what we understand as humanities and stuff like that has to change as well. So I think it's a process from below. So the kind of subaltern work that we're doing must continue in the short term. In the long term, I think those processes are coming from a global angle where the entire ship is changing from within. You're seeing that with the shift of the place that the US had in the world system, the place that Europe had is slowly being edged out, not just by China, by Russia, etc., but by the African continent, by South America, and other places in the Middle East. If you keep an eye on those politics, it's clear that there is hope, even though it looks like a horrible place to be right now, with all the resurgence of nationalism. And those nationalisms have come about because there's no other system intact that can sort of play out right now. So everybody's retreating into their own safety zone. And I'm sorry, this is getting off the question of humanities, but I think it's deeply connected. I think we've got to keep these two processes really, really connected together. So I'm going to shut up there and let others in.
Can I just say one thing about the answer that you gave? I think it's really important that the unipolar shift towards possibly a multipolar may be reframed within a techno-global feudalism.
Yeah,
and a certain kind of shift to, digital currencies and all sorts of the digitalization of this Western imaginary may also be a way that they can resist. Just wanted to throw that in there.
I think also that it's going to have an impact on the West itself.
Yeah,
that precisely is where this entire trajectory of the West is leading. The West, very, very quickly, what we understand of the West, the line that supposedly links the West from the Greeks all the way to the present is inherently nihilistic. That whole development of technology and whatever, and others have done this better than I have, but you can see this very, very clearly. It's basically doom or gloom. And I think that is going to make people think and realize in a different way. So that's part of the process, I think, which is actually undermining what was understood as the Western imaginary, the whole liberal order. But yeah, great point.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions. I have one question before we take other questions, which is related to the process of de-cathecting. I think there was some kind of de-cathecting going on among the Sikhs during the colonial period. As we know, language operates on two levels. One is language is never unaffected by the imperialist forces that control the public and political space. Second is language always has the potential to reinvent itself and subvert the process of time, actually. So Punjabi language went through major transformations during Sufi and Qissa movement. And that was basically Islamicization of Punjabi language that Sufis initiated and Qissa poets continued. Like poets like Waris Shah, their vocabulary is full of Persian, Arabic, Turki words. And if you come to late 19th century and read Maulvi Ghulam Rasool, that is more Farsi and less Punjabi, more Turkish, more Arabic, less Punjabi. So there was, among the Sikhs, there was some resistance in writing about Punjabi because of what had become of Punjabi. Nirmalas and Udasi scholars, they preferred to write in bridge. And Baba Sumer Singh, who was one of very prominent scholars in the late 19th, early 20th century, and when somebody mentioned to him that Bhai Veer Singh has started writing in Punjabi, he was kind of suspicious, like what's going on here. After he read Bhai Veer Singh's Punjabi, he said, this is perfectly fine. So his language, his resistance wasn't with the language that we know as Punjabi. His resistance was against what had become of Punjabi. He was resisting against a Punjabi within Punjabi. And what Bhai Veer Singh created was, he operated on two levels. One is, he brought the effective touches of the language of Gurbani into modern Punjabi poetry. Second, he took the idea of religion out of its modern definition and highlighted the affective aspect of religion and subjective affective connection to both Akal Purkh and the Guru. Like, he did exactly what Heidegger is insisting upon in his article on ontotheology. In the last part, he says, the God before whom we can dance and sing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he is singing and he is highlighting that dimension that modernity or modernist definitions of first religion and then Sikhi had violently undermined. So that was kind of De-Cathecting, I think, was going on and has continued until this day in Professor Mehboob's poetry and in the final phase of Dr. Gurpal Singh's prose writings.
Yeah.
I think starting from the origin with Bhai Gurdas, the reason the Sikhs have maintained some kind of special relationship with poetry or poetic writings, I think that has something to do with the nature of the experiences they wanted to represent through their writings. That's
absolutely great point, and I fully endorse everything you said about the De-Cathecting. Absolutely, it's always going on through the colonial period. And so my answer is yes, it's alive. It has been alive since the very first days of Encounter. What the problem before us now is how to bring that into the forefront of both academic and lived experience, right? Given that there are two battles to fight now. One is the, I think, inevitable marginalization of the Sikh Punjabi experience in India with Hindutva, and then over here as well. So the position of Sikhs as a kind of marginal community now is clearly central to keeping that, not just keeping that process alive of de-cathecting, which you completely right in highlighting. It's there in people like yourself, right? And in others as well who are doing this. I think we have to think strategically in how to bring it to the forefront in things like the academy. So I'm just thinking in terms of strategies more than anything else. What processes do we have when our own community has just become so dumbed down? How do you get it through to the wider community when part of their agenda is just survival at the moment?
I am kind of thinking in romantic terms, in German romantic terms, out of religion into literature. More and more engagements with the literary, with the works. Right now, scholars in Sikh studies, they do engage with the literary works. But when they do, they reduce the literary works to some sort of anthropological data. They do not read poetry as poetry, starting with Christopher Shackle, and it goes on in the among the younger scholars as well. So that's my recommendation. Prof. Sharnbir Singh has a question, and then we have more questions in the chat.
Okay. So thank you, Professor Mandair, for this wonderful presentation. My question is about your comment about modernity as dataization. So as I understand it, this dataization is happening at two planes. One is the external, what we can call as external dataization of social and political processes on the one hand, and dataization of nature on the other hand. And the second plane is that of subjective experience. So this dataization is happening at the subjective plane as well, what Heidegger calls technologization of ways of thinking and technologization of language. So it is happening everywhere. It is a global process. It is happening to Punjabi, to every Chinese, every other language. So I want to connect the idea of decathexis with this process of dataization. So if I understood it correctly, I think decathexis is fundamentally a move away from or disconnecting from this movement towards dataization. So the question is, there are two strategies here. One is what you have suggested as the diasporization of the West. And the other one is, I think that is happening at many places in the world, and what I name discursive off-gridding. Discursive off-gridding is that you just disengage with the dominant modes of thinking. And there are some interesting parallels in Gurbani as well. For example, Sant milai kuch suniya kahiya mila asant mast kar rahiya. So the problem, I am not sure if such a discursive off-gridding is the solution, but I just wanted to know what your thoughts about that are. Thank you.
That's such an amazing question. Let me try and think about it now. So there's two strategies, diasporization of the West and then discursive off-gridding. Let me give you an example. I just did a very small workshop about 8 weeks ago. It was called Geophilosophies. And this is the first of several that I'm going to do on this. And I invited one of the probably the most foremost Black feminist thinker. Her name is Christy Dotson. And for those who know her in Black feminism, she's a living legend, basically. And it was interesting. We spoke one after the other. I spoke first, she spoke second, and I made this kind of pitch for diasporizing the West and for kind of rethinking ontologies, all this kind of stuff. Her immediate reaction was, I'm on the outside. I work on the outside, and I'm going to continue working on the outside. Basically, it was a disengagement. She goes, I don't give a shit about these other academics and whatever. They can just like, you know, I work off the grid. I don't care about what they talk about in my department. I'm going to do what I'm doing. So it's a kind of disengagement while staying in the academy, which is kind of problematic because you can't do that at a certain stage of one's academic career. But I think that kind of disengagement has also resulted in Afro-pessimism as well, right? And I agree with you. I think it is problematic if we just take it as disengagement. But I think a better way might be to do strategic engagement and disengagement at the same time. And I think the strategizing of how to engage and not engage is crucial here. So you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And that means working through modes of life and life worlds which are disengaged, yet keeping them engaged in a broader strategy as well. I think this is a question of leadership as well, of how these intellectual movements are led. And I really can't think of any other way of kind of putting this, but didn't the Singh Sabha do that as well? They engaged, and there were parts of the community that completely disengaged with the British process as well. And yet, you know, they were able to kind of continue to survive and whatever. So I don't have a complete answer, but I don't think you can go off the grid completely, because that's almost tantamount to kind of suicide, intellectual and economic suicide. But you can have periods of strategic disengagement as well, if that makes any sense. Maybe I need to think about this a lot more, but I would want to keep the enemy confused rather than
I was always thinking about here what Harinder Singh Mehboob, when he presents Pehal Taazgi as an alternative to the hegemony of dialectics. That's a really wonderful idea.
Yeah.
The revival of Pehal Taazgi as an alternative to the dialectics. He acknowledges that dialectics is real. It's very powerful. However, communities, when they are in spiritual proximity to their core, they can undo the effects of dialectics on themselves. So that's a great idea, I think. So I agree with you that about off-gridding, there is no simple off-gridding, because there is no simple place where nature is not affected by technology, so you cannot escape. Your thought process is also affected by the devastation of nature. So I agree with you, but I think what I'm trying to say is that we need to explore this side of the argument more.
I see the point. Yeah, it's a very good one. If I could just piggyback very quickly, I think if I can just pull it back into the let's just talk about the academy, for example. I mean, it becomes very difficult when you talk about multiple spheres, but if the academy is still something we're interested in working in, working with, and I think we should be. I think the modern knowledge system can be affected, it can be diasporized, but you have to work right at the source of the problem. And the source of the problem is philosophy. And that is why philosophy departments, unlike all other departments, have been the most resistive to any pluralization, right? If philosophy departments get pluralized, the West begins to disintegrate. I guarantee you, the idea of the West begins to disintegrate. So I think the idea of, this is what I call strategic working. In the same way that Prof. Sharan was talking about language reinventing itself, subverting the processes of time, that's one thing you carry on, definitely. But you also subvert, I think, the citadel of thought as well. And I think it's necessary to kind of occupy that. And I'm seeing good signs. I think it's coming. It looks slow, but it's coming. And the question is, can you take those ideas, bring them into conversation with Western culture, and do something outside of it? Let me give you an anecdote here. If I had to redo my PhD again, I would never have gone to SOAS. I would never have gone to University of Warwick. Knowing what I know now, I would have gone to University College London and become a student of Roy Bhaskar. So what that guy did, he was one of Britain's foremost philosophers for nearly 30, 40 years. He was a brilliant theorist of the Marxist idiom, subverted that, and also a philosopher of science. He did loads of stuff. He was a really, really productive thinker. He was also Anglo-Indian. So his father was a Bengali doctor who settled in the 40s. So he was a diasporic subject. He grew up as completely diasporic in the way that I did, essentially. But he realized the problems with Western philosophy intuitively in the way that I've been working with Spectra of the West. And he subverted that whole process through Western philosophy, but by keeping alive a side of his thinking, which was Indian philosophy. He never brought that in until 1999, 2000. As soon as he did that, the moment he came out of the closet as a non-Western philosopher, as well as being a Western philosopher, the entire Western Philosophical Academy rejected him. They just threw him out. They said, either the guy's gone mad or he's not a true philosopher, right? But basically, he'd done the damage. And the moral of the story is, I think there are ways of doing this now, almost 20 years later, in ways that the Philosophical Academy cannot do what it did to Bhaskar and to other people as well. So I think it's a question of keeping both of these strands alive through strategic processes, basically. Sorry, there's loads of questions more.
Thank you.
Yes, we have quite a few questions. So Paul Puller.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I wanted to go on the notion of resistance and explore that a little bit more, because I've been kind of wrapping my head around resistance, or the notion of diaspora and what that means for how it interacts with the host culture at large. But from our conversation so far, it's appeared to me that resistance seems like a kind of internal resentment that's emerging from the subjective self, but that it's ultimately connecting to the greater episteme, so like the modern knowledge system, and that'd be something which orients the psyche. But what I notice and maybe fear is that there's a fetishization of an authentic indigenous, as well as a yearning for a nostalgic past, and that it might take away from what the present necessitates, and maybe eschews the real, or that which is like right in front of oneself, you know? And then that asks me, like, how is resistance possible in an environment that necessitates a person's wholesale engagement for survival? To me, it reads as like another imaginary or as another fantasy. But then even this notion of like the real is another one of these things. So like I think it's just a question of like practical engagement, or practical effect, and like what that looks like.
That's a good question. So resistance cannot be resistance or remain resistance as long as it remains resentful, and as long as it sticks to ressentiment, as Nietzsche would say. I think what you've got to do, otherwise you will remain in the master-slave dialectic. You will always be an enemy as opposed to a friend, and whatever. It's all kind of nationalist politics there, right? Nobody ever wins except the dominant idiom. The way to solve it is to solve the resentment within oneself. This is an internal spiritual issue, right? If that is solved, that becomes the most powerful force to take into the academy. The question then is, can you turn that solution, overcoming that spiritual overcoming of nihilism within oneself, of the master-slave dialectic, and turn it into intellectual activity? I think you can. And I think many people have tried to do it, have simply been pushed out of the academy, but it's not going to remain so forever. I think the sheer weight of these voices will begin to tell, but it's an internal thing that has to happen. It can never happen. That's why Marxists can't do this. Basically, they remain resentful, because Marxism doesn't solve the internal problem. It keeps it as an external problem. It's just Hegelianism in another form, right? And so, yeah, that's all I'm going to say to that.
We have quite a few questions, but Professor Mandair needs to leave at noon. So we'll quickly take two questions. First by Connor Singh Vanderbeek.
Hello, thank you. So I guess this question, or maybe comment, sort of comes from the fact that I work directly with Professor Mandair. And there is this issue we have in academia where if we speak of changing the system in some sort of substantive way, inevitably we are working as individuals within the system. And as people who are trained in certain academic disciplines, we end up being embedded as individuals in departments where those departments have the ability to sequester us if we go against them. Which I'm sure we've all experienced. It's that as soon as you speak out, you are rendered individual. If you're working within the department, you contribute to the collective. If you're going against, then suddenly you're a pariah. And I wonder how we can think of more collaborative models of generating scholarship, because in reality, there's very few of us who can be the thinker and the public-facing person, and the person who manages to not piss everybody off, and the person who, speaks to or represents specific communities that we come from. And if we think of other sectors of cultural production, like the arts, for example, a single artist has behind them an entire team, or a single celebrity or politician has behind them a whole team, where the public-facing person is just one member of a broader apparatus. And if we can think of, and I know like maybe sick formations is an example of this, or collected volumes are an example of this, but if we can think of more ways to develop these sort of collaborative team-based ways of disseminating knowledge and engaging the public, I wonder if we can actually like broaden our reaches, because not all of us are happy engaging with the public. some of us are happy being private, and then some of us are not happy at all being private?
That's a lovely question. I'm going to answer it like literally very quickly, Connor. And the way I'm going to answer it is I want to say, can you do something like this at our next conference? So this call for collaborative models of scholarship and other forms of resistance, and piggybacking also on Sukhpal's question of resistance, right? Collaboration is resistance in a way. Why don't we take this up as a major collective kind of thought process rather than me trying to answer it, because I'm not sure I have a single answer to this. I've been subjected. So, you know, when this group was together in the early 2010s, the moment I came under attack because of my book, you know, everybody else in the group is affected. But if we had a more robust model of collaboration, I think we would have ridden the storm out much, much quicker, and you know, survived. I think which we have in a way, but it can take everything out of you. And but that's a wonderful thing. We should take this up, I think, as a group, collaborative work. Let's do this.
Professor Pogel.
Sorry, Arvind, to keep you. I just wanted to make sure that we've got something on the radar while we're all here, and that is there's a huge difference between data culture and algorithmic culture. Data produces a document that's visible, that we can work on, we can change it infinitely, we can pass it around. It's something that's above the table. But algorithmic culture is taking all that away, and it's transforming education. So it's underneath the table, it's invisible, it's a document, it's a secret box. And if we're not vigilant enough in terms of understanding AI and algorithmic culture, we're going to be outplayed completely. I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, completely. I tell you, last thing on Friday, we had a faculty meeting, and the last 45 minutes of the faculty meeting was on AI, basically how it's actually undermining our education system as we speak, and we're not even aware of it. So completely, yeah, we should talk about, we should actually do sessions on this. It's really important.
Yeah.
Okay, so we had a few more questions, but we need to sum up the session. Jujar's question would be the last one. Jujar Singh.
Do you need to leave immediately, Professor Mandair? Because
No, I can hang on, don't worry.
Okay. All right. I had 4 or 5 questions. I'm just going to go to my major one. I'm revisiting your book. I also read Empire by Hart and Negri a little while back. But the idea, the concept that I really sort of, I guess, appreciate, feel like it has some uses, and it's something you've lectured on before, is 2 types of modernities, one overcoming the other, and sort of is the overarching modernity that we find ourselves in, which is a very Hegelian sort of modernity. But there's also a very sort of a liberating line of thought within the West, and Professor Poole sometimes refers to them as subversive voices within the West. But I was trying to trace that line back and to see if there's actually something I feel like there would be very useful to find voices within the West which sort of can help dismantle this oppressive sort of Western regime. So I was going back to Duns Scotus as opposed to Thomas Aquinas, and then tracing that line over to perhaps Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, even Nietzsche, and then moving over into Heidegger. Is there like a line that we can use, sort of? Because I feel like there's these two rather than one having one, which obviously it did. Sometimes they're both coeval, and like they're sort of both here within the masses, within even academia. The fact that, you know, voices are allowed from within that academia to speak against the dominant narratives. Even Zizek talks about it, like, you know, there's something here within society that, you know, maybe like a culture that Karst talks about that's opposed to society, or like it's like a larger infinite set of which society is just a subset.
Yeah, lovely question. And that's exactly what the Geophilosophical Encounters book is doing. It's actually bringing that positive process. And I'm working with a number of Western theorists. So yes, you don't, but it's not Western. You'd have to let go of the word Western. And you could call them whatever you want, but it's using thought that is much more immanent than transcendentalist. In that thought process, you would have to counter the effects of political theology, right? By political theology, I mean secularity. The two words are exactly the same. And that's what I'm also showing in the Geophilosophical Encounters book as well. If you can do that, you can break the hold of monotheism, monolingualism, monoracialism, all of these structures, because there's been this push all the way from the beginning to do that. I think the nature of the academy would have to change because of that. That's why I keep talking about philosophy departments. They are important places, because those very same thinkers have been completely kept out by philosophy departments, which have become philosophers, places where you simply stop thinking about thought and they've transferred their entire activity into dataization, basically. And that's what it simply means. And this is the coming to fruition of the strand of nihilism, which has led to the modern sort of Western process itself, basically. So yeah, sorry, I'm in a hurry, so I'm trying to rush this through. But thank you very much for.
Thank you so much, Professor Mandair. We have amazing suggestions for collaborating between departments that Professor Cascio shared with us. And we look forward to hear more from Professor Cascio in future. If she can spare time, we would love to organize a talk by Professor Cascio. And I appreciate once again Professor Mandair for affording time for us. We all know how busy Professor Mandair is, and we really appreciate the audience, all of you who have joined us in the discussion and amazing questions. We will have more lectures in near future. Professor Arvind-Pal Singh from SOAS University of London will be giving a talk soon, and Professor Nikki Singh, Professor Francesca Cascio, and many other scholars. So please subscribe to our newsletter on vancouverinstitute.net, and we'll keep you updated. Thank you so much. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.